A name so common it feels like nothing, a register nobody was supposed to keep this long, and a question that only shows up when you finally look your own surname in the face. Smith, Williams, Johnson, Wilson, Hall, Stewart, Bailey. If one of those is on your birth certificate, or your mother's, or your grandmother's, the 1817 registers have something written down about your family that almost nobody in it has ever read. These are 15 of the most common surnames in Jamaica, and every one of them is pointing at a specific stretch of the African coast. But before we start, let's deal with the thing half of you are already typing. You're going to look at this list and think, these aren't Jamaican names. These are British names. These are the slave masters' names. You're right, every single one. And that is exactly the point. The surname was never the answer. The surname is the address. It tells you which estate, in which parish, in which decade. And once you have that, the registers tell you which stretch of the African coast that estate was buying from. The name is British. What's underneath it never was. Here's what most people never got told. In 1816, colonial authorities in Jamaica passed a law forcing every enslaver on the island to register every single person they held. Name, age, whether they were African-born or Creole, born on the island, updated every 3 years. In writing, by law. The law wasn't passed out of decency. Britain had banned the transatlantic trade in 1807, and slavers kept smuggling anyway. The registers were an accounting tool, a way to catch people cheating. But an accounting tool built to protect property leaves behind the same thing as a census, if the people being counted are the ones reading it 200 years later. Names, ages, estates, parishes. An unbroken paper trail running from 1817 almost to emancipation itself. For 2 centuries, those volumes sat in colonial archives looking like paperwork. Then genealogists digitized them, and suddenly you could line up a surname, an estate, and a parish, and put that next to the shipping records showing exactly which African ports that parish was buying from, year after year after year. That's what this list is. 15 more surnames, counting down. And the one at number 1 is the most common surname in Jamaica, in Britain, and in most of the English-speaking world. It's also the only name on this list that a huge number of families chose for themselves, on purpose, for a reason that will stop you cold. Stick around for the top 3. Number 4 is going to make you look at Trelawny completely differently. Before we get into it, if your family name is on this list, drop it in the comments with the parish your people are from. We've been building a map down there in real time. Bamboo in St. Anne, Port Antonio in Portland, Catadupa in St. James, Fellowship, Bridgewater, people finding cousins they'd never met in a YouTube comment section. Add yours. Name plus parish. That pairing is your starting coordinate. Subscribe while you're at it, because next week we go parish by parish, starting with St. Anne. And that's the one where most of you are going to find your actual answer. All right, let's get into it. Number 15. Elliott. Elliott comes out of the Scottish borders, Reaver country, the lawless strip between Scotland and England, where families survived by raiding cattle and switching sides. When the borders were finally pacified, a lot of those families went looking for somewhere else to be dangerous. A number of them ended up running estates in Jamaica. Elliott settled thinly but persistently, mostly across St. Elizabeth and Manchester in the south. And St. Elizabeth is one of the most interesting parishes on the whole island, because it borders Accompong, the Maroon town in the Cockpit foothills that the British were never able to take. The estates in that part of the island bought consistently through the Gold Coast forts. That's where Accompong's founders came from too. A border raider's name planted on the edge of the one piece of Jamaica the British had to sign a treaty with instead of conquering. Number 14. Bailey. Bailey is English and occupational. A bailiff, the man who collected rent and enforced the landlord's will. The middleman, the one nobody liked. In Jamaica, the name spread widely, but it sits heaviest across Clarendon and St. Catherine, right through the island's central sugar belt. Clarendon's registers show the same split we found last week with Morgan. Gold Coast Akan captives dominating the early decades, then a rising share of West Central Africans, Congo, and Mbundu people as the 1700s wore on. So if you're a Bailey out of central Jamaica, your family sits on top of two of the largest streams in the entire trade, layered one on top of the other, an enforcer's job title, carried now by the descendants of the people it was invented to control. Number 13. Hylton. Hylton is a name that feels completely Jamaican, and that's because in a real sense it is. It started in the north of England as Hylton, a hill settlement, ordinary as dirt. But the spelling with the Y took root in Jamaica specifically, and today there are more Hyltons in Jamaica and the Jamaican diaspora than anywhere else on earth. It concentrates hard in Hanover and Westmoreland, the island's western tip. That corner of Jamaica pulled from the Gold Coast harder and more consistently than almost anywhere else in the Caribbean. Ashanti and Fonte country, modern Ghana, a misspelled English hill that stopped being English somewhere along the way, sitting on top of one of the most concentrated Akan populations outside of Africa. Number 12. Ricketts. Ricketts is where the record gets uncomfortable in a useful way. The Ricketts family were not minor players. They held Canaan Estate in Westmoreland and were connected by marriage into the highest levels of colonial administration. One Ricketts served as governor of Barbados, which means their holdings are unusually well documented. When a family is that prominent, the paperwork survives. Westmoreland's registers point overwhelmingly to the Gold Coast. And Westmoreland has a second distinction. It was the epicenter of Tacky's War in 1760, the largest slave uprising in the 18th century Caribbean, organized by Coromantee, the British name for Akan people shipped out through the Gold Coast forts. Every Ricketts on that estate register was in the middle of that. A governor's family name, sitting directly on top of the parish that came closest to taking the island. Number 11. Salmon. Salmon is one of the ones you asked for, and it's genuinely strange. In England, it's usually from Solomon, a biblical name that got worn down over the centuries. In Jamaica, it's rare enough that most people carrying it are traceable back to a very small number of estates. It sits mostly in St. Elizabeth and Manchester, same southern belt as Elliott, same Gold Coast corridor. But here's what makes Salmon worth putting on a list. Because the name is uncommon, the clustering is tight. If you're a salmon, you are almost certainly connected to other salmons within a few generations, which makes it one of the few names on this list where the registers can genuinely take an individual family somewhere specific. Rare names are harder to find and easier to follow. Number 10. Sinclair. Sinclair is Scottish. You're from Caithness at the very top of the mainland. Clan Sinclair, Earls of Orkney, about as far north as Britain goes. It landed in Jamaica the same way Campbell and Grant did, on the back of the Scottish flood into the sugar economy. By the late 1700s, roughly a third of white men on the island were estimated to be Scots. Sinclair concentrated in St. Mary on the northeast coast. St. Mary's registers lean hard toward the Bight of Biafra, Igbo territory, the Niger Delta, with a steady secondary current from West Central Africa. An earldom from the Orkney Islands, ending up as the surname of families whose ancestors were loaded onto ships at Bonny and Calabar. Number 9. Wilson. Wilson, son of Will, is one you asked for directly, and it's one of the most widespread names on the island. Somebody commented last week that they're a Wilson with Campbell cousins out of Port Antonio, Portland. That's a perfect example of why the parish matters more than the name. Portland is unusual. It's wet, mountainous, isolated on the northeast coast, and its estates were smaller. It couldn't buy in the bulk that the western sugar parishes could. What Portland's registers show instead is a notably high share from the Bight of Benin, Yoruba and Fon country, modern Benin, and southwestern Nigeria. The spiritual and musical traditions that came out of that corridor left fingerprints all over Jamaican folk religion that are still there today. A plain English patronymic sitting on top of the corridor that shaped how the island prays. Number 8. Gayle. Gayle is another one that reads as pure Jamaica. It comes from an Old English word for a boisterous person, but like Hylton, it became far more Jamaican than English. It is heavily concentrated in St. Mary and St. Anne along the north coast, dense enough that in some districts it functions almost like a clan name. St. Anne is the parish we're going deep on next week, and for good reason. Its registers show that layered pattern, early Gold Coast Akan captives, then a heavier later wave from the Bight of Biafra as the North Coast sugar boom expanded. Gayle families out of that stretch are sitting on both. 2 waves, 2 corridors, 1 name. Number 7. Hall was requested more than almost any other name, and it's a good one because it's a trap. In England, Hall means someone who lived or worked at the manor house. In Jamaica, it does something extra. A number of families took the name directly from the estate. Rose Hall, Cinnamon Hill, Content Hall. The Great House was the address, and the address became the surname, which means Hall doesn't point at one African region. It points at whichever great house your family was registered to. Hall clusters across St. James and Trelawny on the northwest coast, the heart of the sugar frontier, and the parishes with the deepest Gold Coast and Bight of Biafra records on the island. If you're a Hall, the name isn't your answer. The estate is, and that estate is written down. Number 6. Powell is Welsh, from A.P. Hywel, son of Hywel. The Welsh were never as numerous in Jamaica as the Scots, but they were there, and they were landowners. Powell spread through Clarendon and St. Catherine, the Central Belt again. Here's the part worth sitting with. Clarendon is where Sir Henry Morgan, the pirate-turned-lieutenant governor we covered last week, ended his career as a planter. It's also where some of the island's largest single estates operated, buying captives in volumes that smaller parishes never approached. Big estates mean bulk purchasing. Bulk purchasing means the shipping records are clear. Powell families out of Clarendon are traceable through some of the best documented purchase patterns in the entire Jamaican archive. A Welsh patronymic resting on top of the most legible paperwork on the island. Number 5. McKenzie is a Highland clan out of Ross-shire, and in Jamaica it is everywhere, but it is thickest in Portland and St. Thomas in the east. St. Thomas is the parish we ended on last week, with Bogle and Gordon, Morant Bay, the 1865 rebellion. Its registers point overwhelmingly toward the Bight of Biafra, but McKenzie has a second thread. The name shows up repeatedly in and around Maroon communities in the east. In the Blue Mountains above Portland, the Windward Maroons, who fought the British to a treaty in 1739 and were never conquered. A Highland clan name sitting simultaneously on the parish that rose up in 1865 and the mountains the British could never take. Same name, 2 different kinds of refusal. Number 4. Stewart is the name of the Royal House of Scotland. It doesn't get much grander, and in Jamaica it belongs to a very specific place, Stewart Castle in Trelawny, a fortified great house built by a Scottish planter on the north coast, with gun loops in the walls, because the men who built it expected to be attacked. They were right to. Trelawny borders the cockpit country. The Trelawny town Maroons fought 2 wars against the British out of that terrain, and the Second Maroon War in 1795 ended with hundreds of them deported to Nova Scotia, and then to Sierra Leone, sent back across the same ocean their grandparents were dragged over. Trelawny's estates leaned heavily on Coromantee captives, Gold Coast, Akan, so the Royal House of Scotland put its name on a castle with gun holes in it, in the one parish where the enslaved population's ancestry was so concentrated and so organized that the British had to build for a siege. That's not a coincidence. That's cause and effect. Number 3. Johnson. Now we're into the heavy hitters, and the last 3 all work the same way, which is the whole point of this video. Johnson, son of John. One of the most common surnames in the English-speaking world. In Jamaica, it's scattered across every single parish, which means as a genealogical arrow, it's almost useless on its own. Pull 100 Jamaican Johnson families, and you'll find Akan, Igbo, Congo, and Yoruba ancestry all represented. But here's why that matters instead of being a dead end. A name that common, that evenly spread, that untethered from any one estate, usually means one thing. It was taken at or after emancipation in 1838, when hundreds of thousands of people needed a surname for the first time as free citizens and chose one that belonged to nobody in particular. Johnson isn't a weak signal. It's a signal about the moment of freedom itself. Number 2. Williams is the second most common surname in Jamaica, and it does exactly what Johnson does, but harder. Welsh in origin, son of William. In Jamaica, it is absolutely everywhere, in every parish, on every kind of estate, in every decade of the registers. And the same logic applies. Where a name is that common and that evenly distributed, the registers stop being about the name and start being about the parish. A Williams from Westmoreland and a Williams from St. Thomas are looking at two completely different African corridors. Gold Coast on one side of the island, Bight of Biafra on the other. Same surname. 1,500 kilometers apart at the source. If you carry Williams, do not assume your cousin's answer is your answer. Ask which parish. Every time. Number 1. Smith, and here it is. The most common surname in Jamaica. The most common surname in Britain. The most common surname in most of the English-speaking world. Smith. A blacksmith. The plainest occupational name that exists. There is no clan behind it, no castle, no coat of arms that means anything. And that is precisely why it belongs at number 1 on this list. Because when emancipation came in 1838, hundreds of thousands of people who had been registered as property, first name only, no surname, listed under someone else's ledger, walked out and had to choose a name. Some took the estate, some took the planter, and a great many deliberately took the most anonymous name available in the entire English language. A name that couldn't be traced back to any owner. A name that belonged to everybody, which meant it belonged to nobody, which meant for the first time it could belong to them. Smith was not a name they were given. For a huge number of Jamaican families, Smith was the first free decision anyone in that bloodline had made in 200 years. They chose a name specifically designed to be untraceable, and the registers, the ones written to keep track of them as property, are the exact thing that lets us trace them anyway. That's the thing nobody tells you about these records. They were written by people who thought they were doing bookkeeping. Every entry was made to protect somebody's investment. Not one line of it was written for us. And it's the only reason any of this is recoverable at all. The system that tried to erase your family kept the receipts. It couldn't help itself, so the surname on your birth certificate isn't the end of the story. And it was never supposed to be the whole story. It's a coordinate. It tells you where the paperwork stopped. The registers tell you where the family started. If your name came up, put it in the comments with your parish. And subscribe, because next week we go into St. Anne, every estate, every corridor, the whole parish. And if your people are from that stretch of the North Coast, that's the video where your family shows up by name. Your surname has been trying to tell you something your whole life. It's about time somebody read it back to you.